Thank you. Thank you so much, Judith, for that lovely intro. It's always so cringe when someone's talking about you and you're in the room. Thank you for that. And hi, everyone. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you this evening. My name is Vicki Carse, and I'm the Head of Psychological Development here at Lexic, and I'm also a Chartered Occupational Psychologist. I've been working in the field of neurodiversity for Lexic for over 10 years now, so hopefully I'll be able to impart some of my knowledge onto you this evening. I'm going to just show you what we're going to cover. There will be opportunity for questions at the end, so if you have any whilst we're going through the session, please do jot them down. You can note them down in the chat. Judith is very kindly going to be keeping an eye on the chat for any questions, and she'll put them across at the end. So feel free to get your questions ready. But this evening we're going to be looking at, what is neurodiversity, what it's not, why we should care about neurodiversity. We'll be looking at the strengths and the talents that neurodiverse individuals bring, particularly to organisations. We're going to look at how to empower neurodiverse staff within the workplace. What does a neuro-inclusive organisation even look like, and how do we achieve this? And I'll give you a flavour of some of the adjustments that can make the world of a difference for neurodiverse individuals, in addition to neuro-inclusive communication. But firstly, it might be helpful just to share a little bit briefly about Lexic. So we were established almost 15 years ago by Nicola James, who is a Chartered Occupational Psychologist. Nicola was late diagnosed with dyslexia in her final year of university, so it wasn't picked up in her primary or secondary education. It was when she was at university and she was achieving first grade marks for her presentations, but she was actually failing in the written elements, so the essays and the exams. And it turned out she had dyslexia. So when she entered the workforce, she realised that there weren't any adjustments or processes that were aligned to her dyslexia. She felt like she had to mould herself around the organisation, couldn't really be herself in the workplace, so was inspired to create Lexic so that she could offer the support that she received in education to others that may be facing the same challenges. We're now a team of over 50 people across the UK and Ireland. And we regard ourselves as leaders in this area in terms of neurodiversity, being the first consultancy in the UK. And we're now starting to work on a global level with clients across the globe, which is really exciting. Our mission is absolutely a world where all minds belong. And when it comes to neurodiversity, we really champion empowering the individual with neurodifferences, empowering the workforce and empowering organisations. So I will be talking about that this evening. So what is neurodiversity? You may have come across this concept before. You may identify as neurodiverse yourself. But before we dig into this, I want to ask you to consider a problem. And it's a seemingly basic maths problem, which is what happens in your head when you add 28 plus 47. And if you're willing, feel free to take a moment to try it for yourself and jot down your process. But in April last year, a social media account posted this, and in a basic maths problem, they were really interested in finding out how people got to the answer. The post on social media got, I think it was close to 2 million comments. So if you've had a chance to try that for yourself, you might have done it in your head. These are some of the workings from the social media post. And the answer is 75, which most people get to eventually. But what's important to note is the very different processes that people use to get to that answer. You might recognise the way that you worked it out from this slide here. Feel free to share in the chat if you identify with any of those problems. I know that Brian, you've put 75, Morag, you've just put your working out there. Yeah, so for us, this really highlights the diversity of thought among people. And we think it's a really, really useful way to help think about the vast spectrum of neurodiversity. So neurodiversity essentially refers to the differences in the way a person's brain processes information. We all think and behave differently, but the neurodiversity movement as such was coined by Judy Singer, who is an Australian sociologist who herself identifies as autistic, and she coined this movement back in the 1990s. It's commonly used as an umbrella term to describe individuals with the likes of dyslexia, developmental coordination disorder, also known as dyspraxia, dyscalculia, ADHD, which is attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and autism spectrum conditions. And as humans in general, regardless of whether we have a neurodifference, we all have our unique strengths and challenges, preferences, likes and dislikes. And I will dig in a bit deeper to each of these neurodifferences shortly. But I'm just curious to know if you're aware of how many individuals in the UK and Ireland identify with a neurodifference. And again, feel free to pop your guesstimate in the chat. Some of you may know this already if you have read the CIPD Neurodiversity at Work report. So lots of people going for 1 in 7. Susan, you're saying 1 in 10. There's a 1 in 30. So again, a variation of responses there. So I guess this is up for a little bit of a debate, but I guess the most accurate answer is 1 in 7, which equates to approximately 15% of the UK population. Depending on where you look for this information, it's claimed that it could be as many as 20% of the population. I mean, having worked in this field for over a decade, I think that we also need to consider that it's likely to be higher because this is just based on people who have chosen to disclose or have gone forward for diagnostic assessment. There are many people out there that have not gone through that process, so are not aware that they have a neurodifference. And we're seeing that now, particularly around women who are maybe in their 40s or 50s, whose kids have been diagnosed and they identify the traits in themselves. So that is piquing their curiosity to find out if they might have something like dyslexia or autism. So I guess the point is you likely already have people in your own organisations with neurodiversity. Do you know them? Have you spoken to them? Do you know if there's processes in place that are neuro-inclusive for them? And again, having reflected on working in this field for over a decade, in my experience, you either have a neurodifference yourself or you know someone who does. It seems to touch all of us in some way or another. However, most of us have been taught to think about neurodiversity as a deficit model. So we often hear references to the likes of learning disability, learning disorder, specific learning difficulty. I've heard encounters from lots of clients in the past who've said that, you know, I was put in the special needs class at school. And I'm using ADHD as an example. You might say that it has double-barreled shame associations because it has deficit and disorder included in there, as if you needed a reminder. But this type of model, which focuses almost exclusively on impairments and limitations, can ultimately lead us to see neurodiverse individuals as, you know, broken people who might need to be fixed. But, you know, reflecting on my experience in this field, you know, the vast majority of individuals don't identify as disabled or disordered by their neurodifference. It's just a different way of thinking, and we need to look at a strengths-based approach rather than focusing on the deficits. So I guess, you know, the neurodiversity movement really challenges us to rethink the concept through the lens of human diversity. You know, it asks us to value diversity in neurodevelopment as we would in any other category, such as gender, race, ethnicity, religion, or sexual orientation. And for me in particular, it's really important to again, you know, stop focusing on the things that neurodivergent people can't do and start focusing on their unique strengths that only they can bring to the organisation. What are they exceptional at? So this brings us to looking at the strengths and talents of neurodifferences, and I've included this table here, which is from a great report. If you haven't seen it, I recommend to read it. It's quite a good read made by Dyslexia, Connecting the Dots, and this just gives an idea of the types of areas where individuals with dyslexia thrive and flourish. So areas like being creative, being good at problem solving, thinking outside the box, etc. are areas of real strength and talent. And I've included some other examples here, and I would just say that they're not exhaustive. This is not an exhaustive list, it's just a high level overview of the strengths that we see in individuals with neurodifferences. A lot of I guess a lot of misconception, especially around ADHD, is individuals might be high energy and they can't focus on tasks, but sometimes they can actually hyper focus on tasks. And again, it just comes down to the individual. Autism, for example, individuals who identify with autism tend to be more logical in their thinking, pay high attention to detail, which means that they can notice patterns that others can't see, and that's often why they thrive in professions like coding and IT. I wondered if you were familiar with any famous people with a neurodifference. Do you know of any famous faces or celebrities? I'm often asked by clients, you know, I have dyslexia, can I be successful? Or I have autism, can I do well in this job? And the answer is absolutely yes, especially if the person is in a role where their strengths are able to flourish. So again, feel free to use the chat and pop down some famous faces that you recognise. Hazel, you've put Richard Branson and Steve Jobs, yes. Yep. Richard Branson openly talks about his dyslexia. Stephen Fry, yep. Christine McGuinness, yeah. Keira Knightley, yeah. And I do think that the documentary that was on recently with Christine McGuinness, I imagine, Emma, you've seen that, Paddy McGuinness's wife. They were talking about their 3 kids who are all autistic, and that led Christine to seek a diagnostic assessment for herself, and it was actually confirmed that she has autism, but it wasn't until she recognised the traits in her children that she realised that. Yeah, Greta Thunberg. So these are some examples here. Some of those you've already identified are on this slide. Steve Jobs, Sir Jackie Stewart, the F1 racing driver, identifies as dyslexia. He's actually the president of Dyslexia Scotland. I don't know if you knew that, but yeah, a whole kind of variation of professions here, you know, from actors, actresses, innovators, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Elon Musk announced, I think it was in May last year on Saturday Night Live, that he identifies with Asperger's. So it is more common than we might think. So I'm just going to go on to share a bit about some of the common traits associated with the neurodifferences, and getting into talking about maybe more of the sort of challenges that individuals face. But first I want to ask you to do an activity with me. So I want you to put yourself in the shoes, in this instance, in the shoes of someone with dyslexia. So if I was to ask you, what is it like to have dyslexia? I'm going to give you a flavour of that just now. So I want you to listen to me reading a passage. And as you listen, I want you to write down exactly what I'm saying. But as you write, I want you to replace each vowel letter in the words with the @ symbol that you would see in your email address. So there's an example there. The dog was brown would look like this. So feel free to type it into your computers, or if you've got a pen and paper there, feel free to give it a go. So I'm just going to start reading just now. About 30 years ago, when I was a young woman, I was presented with a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to travel the world with my best friend. We thought it would be a mistake to let the opportunity pass us by. After all, we wanted to see the world before we settled down and started having families. So off we went with just a backpack each. We started off in Australia and travelled across many countries before ending up back home in the United Kingdom. So this is what you should have, something that looks like this, if you were able to complete that. It's always tricky when we do this exercise online, because it's hard to gauge people's reactions. The amount of times that I've done this in a face-to-face environment, and people start putting their pens down, after you've read the first 5 or 7 words, and look at me as if I'm a bit mad. Like, what are you trying to get me to do here? But this gives an example of what it might be like when you can't quickly retrieve letters for words. You can't remember what the word looks like, or how to spell it. You have difficulty maybe holding that information in your short-term memory to concentrate on the next few words that are coming. And this was done in a fairly relaxed environment. There's no pressure in the situation. I was reading at a slower pace, although you might disagree with me there. But imagine how you might feel if you had dyslexia and you were taking notes for an important meeting, or you were taking notes whilst learning new material. It might even be if you were taking a message for a colleague and passing it on. Those kind of day-to-day tasks that some of us might take for granted are extremely difficult for someone that might have dyslexia. So in dyslexia, this primarily impacts the language region of the brain. So it impacts the ability to acquire accurate and fluent words, reading and spelling. Difficulties associated with dyslexia, as I'd mentioned, can be related to issues in short-term memory. So in particular, your working memory, which is your auditory short-term memory. So it's your ability to hold, it's like your brain's post-it note, it's got a limited capacity. It's the ability to hold on to the information, to process it and pass it on. Things like reading speed can be impacted, and reading retention. So what we often find in individuals with dyslexia is that they're constantly having to reread information to take any of it in, and following multiple instructions can be really, really challenging as well. On the flip side of that, though, I have worked with some individuals with dyslexia who have a love of reading. They don't find lots of difficulties in reading, but it's more the writing element. So I think it's really important to emphasize that you will never find two individuals with dyslexia with the same challenges, the same strengths. So it's really important to bear that in mind when, especially for us, when we're working with individuals in terms of what we would recommend for adjustments in the workplace. Dyspraxia, also known as developmental coordination disorder, mainly affects gross and fine motor coordination. So this might affect planning of movement, planning of coordination. An individual with dyspraxia may present as really clumsy or disorientated in terms of day-to-day activities. It's really common in individuals with dyspraxia to maybe have difficulty like passing a driving test, for example, may have passed on a third or fourth or fifth attempt. Might be really challenging to do things like aerobics workouts, coordinating left and right, for example. And also what we find in adults in particular, because these are developmental conditions and that you're born with them, the individual develops coping strategies throughout their life to put in place. So the challenges can tend to be masked in adulthood. So what that means is they've developed coping strategies that they kind of overcome their challenges. But in dyspraxia, it's really common for individuals to have challenges with time management, timekeeping, planning, prioritizing, etc. You might want to reflect on what activities you've done today that required movement, and that helps to consider the challenges, the day-to-day challenges that an individual with dyspraxia might face. So for example, if you've done a workout, well done if you have. Driving might present a challenge. So feel free to pop down in the chat if you think of any others that might be yeah, Brian, you've said yoga, driving, golf. Yeah, they could be really tricky. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to talk about dyscalculia and ADHD next. And dyscalculia, if you think of dyslexia as difficulties with language, dyscalculia impacts the ability to acquire numbers, so number-related concepts and numeracy skills. Individuals may have difficulty understanding simple number concepts like, confusing the plus, subtract, multiply, divide symbols, may lack an intuitive grasp of numbers and have problems learning number facts and procedures. Often in dyscalculia, individuals may produce the right answer for maths problems, but they maybe can't tell you how they got to the answer. In ADHD, there are three main sort of symptoms that can impact on an individual. These tend to be inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. And inattention is where someone may be distracted easily by their environment. They may find it difficult to complete tasks, so maybe have various tasks going on at any sort of one time, may start something but not finish it. When it comes to the sort of hyperactivity element, the individual may present as being really restless or have high energy. I have a colleague in my team who identifies with ADHD, and she said she feels like she's being driven by a motor. So she tends to have to get up and walk around the room to get rid of some of the energy that she's got in her body. And impulsivity, individuals with ADHD, their minds they're having lots and lots of thoughts, and they may interrupt you, because if they don't interrupt you to tell you what they're thinking, they'll just forget about it and move on to the next thing. So that's how it can sort of present. And other kind of challenges that they might face is around organisation and time management, completing paperwork, getting to work on time, for example, as well. And I think, again, just to mention about the hyperfocus, is it is really common in ADHD, that individuals are able to hyperfocus. I once worked with a client who was an accountant, and he explained that he got so absorbed in gaming that it was really common for him to be gaming after work until the early hours of the morning, and he wouldn't realize the time. So he would just get so absorbed and hyper focus on a task. In ADHD, just before I move on, it's misunderstood that it's just a childhood condition, if you like. I know individuals who have gone to the GP and asked for a diagnosis for ADHD and been told it doesn't exist in adults. But it doesn't just go away, and it goes back to the point that I made earlier about individuals developing coping strategies that maybe mask the symptoms. But sometimes if an individual is under stress or pressure, their coping mechanisms break down, and that's when it can appear to be more of a challenge. I've got another activity for you, just to make sure you're still with me. I would like you to just spend no more than about 30 seconds or so drawing an alien fruit. So if you were to go to an alien planet, what do you think a piece of fruit there would look like? So I'm just going to give you a little while for that. How did you get on with that? I'm not expecting you to show everyone your alien fruit, don't worry. So this was a study that was in the Journal of Creative Behaviour, where researchers asked about 26 college students with ADHD and 26 students without ADHD to perform 2 creativity tests. And the first involved inventing and drawing alien fruit without copying those on Earth. And the students with ADHD were shown to be able to create more unique fruit. So you can see that from the slide, where the group on the right was the individuals with ADHD, and you can see that their fruit is slightly more unusual than the one on the left with the non-ADHD group. I think in the one on the left you can easily identify like a strawberry, a tomato, grapes. Those on the right as well seem to have been given faces, eyes, a mouth. So that's what was found. And one of the key strengths that is noted time and time again in ADHD is creativity. I'm going to just talk briefly about autism now, and then we'll go on to looking at what does this look like in organisations, and what can we do about it. Autism spectrum condition essentially affects how a person communicates with and relates to the world around them. And this may present challenges in areas that come more naturally to others. So social communication, social interaction. Individuals with autism may also have a preference for rules and routine, and can have sensory sensitivities. What I mean by that is it's very common in autism for an individual to be highly sensitive to sound or light. For social communication, this is all around reading emotion from social cues such as facial expressions, body language, tone of voice. Social interaction is very much around the ability to follow social rules, like not standing too close to someone, and social imagination, which is perspective taking. It's predicting what other people's behaviour, and being able to imagine situations outside of daily life. Again, difficulties in individuals with autism can vary significantly, and individuals may be highly gifted, maybe have intense interests in specialist areas, so may be able to talk to you to the nth degree about their specialist area. And I'll talk to you more about that in terms of the workplace and what we can do. Just briefly, because I think these are important to consider as well, cognitive functioning comes into this because an individual can acquire a neurodiversity. So what we mean by this is if an individual experiences changes in their brain as a result of such as a medical condition, like a stroke or a degenerative condition or a head injury, it can lead to things like acquired dyslexia, which is alexia, acquired dyspraxia, which is apraxia. So I think for particularly individuals working in occupational health, HR, if there are any sort of changes to an individual's performance, this might be considered in terms of the person's capability to do the job role. And really importantly, I want to touch on mental health and well-being, because the co-occurrence between neurodiversity and mental health is very high. We see a lot of the time individuals with a neurodifference are also reporting anxiety or depression, and it's very common that individuals would come to us as kind of like a last resort. It's like, well, I think I might have dyslexia, I think I'm autistic or have ADHD, I'm underperforming at work, I'm at risk of losing my job, so that takes its toll on an individual. So we address this in our approach to working with clients as well, to make sure that they have the right support in place. So how do we, what can we do to empower neurodiversity in the workplace? What tends to happen when people choose to disclose a neurodifference? We know that many people we speak to don't feel like they belong at work. They don't feel like they can disclose or bring their whole selves to work. There's many reasons for this. It could be the stigma around neurodiversity, the fear of being treated differently, the perception of not being able. So, oh, if I tell my boss I might have dyslexia, he's not going to give me the reading tasks or the writing tasks, or I'm not going to get that promotion that I really wanted. And as a result, individuals tend to use coping strategies that are detrimental to them in the long run. So a classic example is working extra to get the job done, but that's just not sustainable. Many of us don't know what to do. We don't know the language to use around neurodiversity. This is a piece of research that was done in 2020 by the Institute of Leadership and Management. And it was shown that of 1,000 individuals that were surveyed, half of them said that they would be uncomfortable employing or line managing someone with a neurodifference. We don't know enough about it, so we need to work to tackle the kind of misconceptions around what it is and what it isn't. There's a legal argument for neurodiversity as it stands just now is covered by the Equality Act under the Disability Protected Characteristic. That tells us that there's a requirement to make reasonable adjustments for the likes of dyslexia. And unfortunately, we do see the results if this isn't catered for. And I'm just going to use an example here of a really well-known famous case against Starbucks, where an employee made errors when noting down temperatures on fridges, and she was accused of falsifying data rather than it being because of her dyslexia. There weren't any adjustments in place for her, which meant that the employee won her tribunal case. And this is what we see time and time again when we don't address neurodiversity. This is what happens. Organisations become more sort of reactive, only supporting individuals when it's become like a last resort. Having low levels of awareness can really impact psychological safety. So not talking about it and not addressing it, it's not going to encourage you to come forward and share your story or your lived experience. Not having any sort of processes in place for how to support your neurodiverse staff if they do choose to disclose. And there's a major untapped potential. People might be in, they may be not in a job where they're able to showcase their talents and their strengths and thrive in the workplace. But I'm just going to run through some examples of where we're seeing it starting to change. So, more and more organisations are sort of coming forward and showcasing neurodiversity and what they've seen in their organisations. JP Morgan and Chase is a really good example because they have a global autism at work initiative where they have recruited over 200 people on the spectrum across 40 different job roles in 8 different countries. And they've shown that individuals tend to be more sort of productive, more innovative. We're not saying that, if you hire individuals with autism, they're all going to be this productive or innovative, but it just shows, the argument for focusing on talent rather than deficit. Microsoft have become a beacon of best practice for a person first inclusivity framework. So they have developed processes where they screen candidates to demonstrate their true strengths. So rather than looking at soft skills like social interaction, they are looking for how the candidate performed on job-related tasks. And finally, this was in a recent report by Manpower. It was Skills for Today's Workplace. Their VP of Facebook has really showcased this, and I just love what he says there in terms of this being a superpower. I wonder how we would think differently if we all took that approach to neurodiversity. But he's arguing for looking to future skills, looking to future job roles even, and neurodiversity being a competitive advantage essentially. So what are some of the practical changes and practical things we can do? First of all, there is no one size fits all. There's no kind of best way to go about this. Every organisation is going to be unique. But we very much, based on our experience, believe that it takes more than just the individual. So it shouldn't just be down to the individual to mould themselves around an organisation to fit in around here. Organisations need to be looking at this at a strategic level to change their cultures, to change their processes and make them neuro-inclusive across the employee life cycle. And one thing I was keen to show you was looking at it through a neurodiversity smart lens. So looking at the employee life cycle and considering, okay, does an individual need adjustments for the recruitment process so that they can best showcase the talents for the job? And then looking at how that person is onboarded, what sort of processes are in place for them, are there any adjustments, etc. How they perform their job role, do they need adjustments there? And looking at things like the environment in the organisation, is it neuro-inclusive? So looking at how the environment is laid out, if it's an office environment, for example. And we just really believe and see the benefits in taking more of a holistic approach, so not relying on the individual to make all the changes. For the individual though, I've just included, and these slides will get sent around, I'm just conscious of the time, so I'm just kind of rushing through these. But these are the kind of common services available. So first sort of protocol would always be like a diagnostic assessment to identify what is going on for that individual. It's very common for neurodiversity to overlap. So we often see individuals with dyslexia and dyspraxia. It could be dyslexia and ADHD. There's a member of my team that has dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, and ADHD. So that makes, I guess, our jobs as psychologists really, really interesting, because we get to try and pick apart all the traits that are being sort of presented to us and make the best recommendations for ways forward. Workplace assessments are key to making sure that the right adjustments are in place for that individual, but also for their line manager and their team as well, and to try and encourage some sort of a conversation and awareness around that. And also one-to-one coaching. So this is where it really kind of brings everything together for the individual, based on coaching them through the sort of job skills coaching, but also the kind of more strategies related to mental health. So like I'd said before, it's looking at it through both angles. So looking at things like resilience, mindfulness, building up confidence again. We take that approach. Adjustments, looking at giving some examples for this. So if we're looking at dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, this is just an example of some of the most common challenges that we see. And in terms of challenges with reading and writing, individuals may take longer to complete tasks, so as a result might need some sort of a leeway on their targets, might need additional time for tasks, for example, particularly if they're timed. Assistive technology can make the world of a difference. Read text-to-speech software, where the computer reads the text to you, is so beneficial for an individual that rereads constantly, has to break down reading sort of into chunks because their concentration just can't take reading a 10-page document. Having this piece of software just completely changes the reading experience for that individual. In terms of short-term memory, it's looking at using visual aids where possible, using to-do lists, reminders on your diary, on your phone, giving instructions one at a time. If you're a line manager and you're having to give a task to an individual, sending a follow-up email once you've had a verbal conversation with someone to make sure that they've got the main points down if they need to action anything. And like I'd mentioned, confidence and resilience. So confidence can be affected by previous experience in employment, or even people carrying kind of baggage from school days where they were maybe made to feel in a certain way. It's encouraged, for line managers in particular who have that influence and that kind of closeness to the individual, to focus on the positives. What is the person bringing to the team? What are they doing well? And take a balanced approach to feedback. For autism and ADHD, some autistic individuals can have a real challenge with understanding instructions. Communication can be interpreted literally. So it's trying not to assume the person will infer your meaning from informal instructions. An example, just a silly example, is, instead of saying something like, can you send everyone a copy of this document, it's say, make 3 copies of this and give 1 each to Sam, Teresa and Mina. And people with ADHD would also benefit from that if they have challenges with inattention. But it's making sure that things like the environment is well structured for the individual. The work might need to be well structured, particularly in autism, where individuals prefer routine. They prefer to know what's happening, dislike any sort of changes to their day-to-day role. So just taking that into account and looking to address any sort of sensory sensitivities that can cause overwhelm and distraction. So just as I mentioned before, the reliance for change shouldn't just be on the individual. This is taken from the Business Disability Forum, the Great Big Workplace Adjustment Survey, which said that, you know, adjustments for the individual don't remove barriers elsewhere in the organisation. And examples of barriers might be things like attitudes from managers, as we've seen in that research from the ILM. It could be access to learning and development opportunities that are not accessible to that individual, opportunities for promotion and progression, you name it, there might be a barrier there. So it's looking at this at a systemic level, not just the individual. I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes max going through neuro-inclusive communication, because I would really love to hear from you and take any of your questions. But I think it's just really important to not be scared to have these conversations, to talk up about neurodiversity, to encourage people to share their lived experience, because once someone does share their experience, it's almost like a ripple effect that inspires others to do the same. But how do we go about this? And I think it's just considering the language that's being used in your organisation, and ask the individual how they prefer to be identified. Some people prefer to be identified using person first language, others prefer identity first language. What I know for sure is everyone is going to have preferences, different preferences from each other. Some individuals that have dyslexia hate being referred to as neurodiverse. So I think, again, it's just trying not to shy away from these types of conversations, because there's no hard and fast rules about the language to use with individuals, and just try and sort of take their lead and ask. I've given an example here about fonts to write in a neurodiversity friendly format. Believe it or not, that text there, which hopefully you can see is actually moving on the screen. This is a simulation of a piece of code created by a Swedish web developer to try and show how some passages of text can appear to those with dyslexia. So by changing the kind of format, the fonts that you're using, you will hopefully avoid things like this happening. I've just included another couple of ideas here, but I'm just really keen to show you and ask for your opinion on this slide. You know, which version would you prefer to read? Would it be the one on the left or the one on the right? If I was to tell you that this is the exact same piece of text, it has the same amount of words, it's the same content, word for word, it's the same. Feel free to pop in the chat which one you would prefer to read. Morag, Susan, you're saying the one on the right, the one on the right. Feel free to share why you would prefer the one on the right. Ah, Jane, you're saying the yellow, yeah, the yellow works or doesn't work? Yellow does work. The spacing, yeah. Spacing, yellow makes it much clearer, yeah. So I guess even regardless of whether you have dyslexia or a neurodifference, this can help all of us, right? I've just included a couple of slides on some accessible formats, and also just some considerations about communication with an individual with autism. I've included some tips for performance management if you're going through that process with someone with neurodiversity, and I've also included a slide on tips for, you know, if you're doing interviews with an individual. But I am going to race to this slide because I know I've gone slightly over, and I could talk about this literally all day. So that was just a whistle-stop tour of neurodiversity. So hopefully you enjoyed that, and feel free to throw any questions my way. Thank you.
It was absolutely super, Vicki. I think the dyslexia exercise was particularly powerful. I gave up at World. I thought, well, yeah, some people did better than that. Dan, I know, had put a question in the chat earlier, asking if there were any stats on what percentage of people have more than one neurodiversity.
Oh, that's a good question. I would love to know the answer. I would be lying if I made up an answer, but I would say, you know, having assessed individuals with neuro differences for a long time, it's very, very common to not have a neuro difference in isolation. I mean, I would say maybe 1 in 3, 1 in 4 have a co-occurring neuro difference. And I would actually say 9 times out of 10 individuals with neuro differences have a mental health challenge as well. So we need to look at what we can do there. Is there any other questions? Does that help?
Yeah.
Probably not.
Hi there, Jane had a question. Is there a link for where we can see the Connecting the Dots report?
Yeah, I can put a link to that. I can put a link to the Institute of Leadership and Management report. It's Neurodiversity, the Power of Difference. That's such a good report to read. You might need to log in or register to access the report. I might have a copy, so I could maybe dig that out and send it on to you, Judith.
That would be great. Yeah, I can make sure that's available. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Brian's asking, given neurodiversity issues tend to be picked up early in life, any knowledge of levels of support for primary education on the likes of dyslexia and autism / ADHD?
Yeah, that's an interesting question and a tricky one as well, because I think we're getting better at identifying neurodifferences in education, and I do believe that early intervention is so important. I know that it varies depending on where you are in the country in terms of the provision by your local authorities and things like that. Dyslexia Scotland are a fantastic resource for parents. They signpost to various solutions for parents. And for autism, there's the National Autistic Society as well. But we're just learning all the time. You know, there's so many autism cases being identified and picked up earlier now than ever, and it is simply because we know more about it. We didn't really know much about it a decade, 20 years ago. So I think that with the research that's coming out now, that just helps to inform how we work best to support these individuals.
Yeah, there's Laura, I'm sorry, I don't know Laura's surnames, is interested in you coming to speak to Sport Scotland.
Yeah, that would be awesome. I'd love that. Sign me up.
And Kerry's asking, when doing diagnostic assessments, do they have to be carried out by specialists? So
it's only occupational psychologists and specialist teachers that can diagnose dyslexia, dyspraxia and dyscalculia. We can also screen for traits associated with ADHD and autism. However, autism and ADHD need to be formally diagnosed by either a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist because of the medical nature. So individuals with ADHD might need to be prescribed medication. So that would be the differentiator there.
Okay. And Susan's asking, in the workplace, what might be the most common neurodifferences that we might see, and is there an industry / sector difference?
Oh, that's such a good question. I don't know if there's one common neurodifference. I would say the most common neurodifference in the workplace is still dyslexia. But closely followed by that is autism. We're seeing a lot of autism and people coming forward for support. But having said that, the employment gap for autistic individuals is still significant, and that has actually been worsened by the pandemic. So there's so much for us to do to bridge that gap between, to help autistic individuals to get into and sustain work. I hear all the time from parents whose kids have autism. They can't get a job, so they keep going back to uni. So they end up with like 4 degrees, 5 masters, because they can't get employed. And these are, really bright, talented individuals, but how we judge someone in an interview is by how they present and how they interact with us. If an individual is in an interview and they're looking around the room because they have trouble maintaining eye contact, which we see in autism, they can often be discounted for being disinterested, disengaged. So there's adverse impact there, and it's our absolute mission to educate organisations on what to look out for when you're interviewing an individual with neurodiversity, and don't write them off because of that. But I think it just goes back to the example that I gave with Microsoft, where they are assessing job-based skills rather than the softer skills when it comes to interaction. And I think we could all do with having a look at our job descriptions and asking, is this really an essential requirement now, particularly if it involves interaction?
Yeah. No, that's a good shout. Sandy's saying, what's been the impact of working from home for formerly office-based neurodiverse employees?
Oh, another really good question. Oh, I love these questions. So twofold. It's either worked in the individual's favour, so they're suddenly able to control their environment. So they may be gone from working in an open plan office where they're completely distracted, being overloaded with sensory sensitivities, to going into their home. They can control their home environment, and they can shut themselves in an office, manage their distractions however they like. So it's worked really well for I would say the majority of individuals that we've worked with. On the other side, there are some individuals who have really struggled, particularly early on in this pandemic. I cannot believe that it's gone on for almost 2 years, but back in the day, in March, April, May 2020, when people were suddenly thrust into having to work from home and homeschool, have kids in the house, that was just not productive, probably for none of us, but for individuals with autism, where they really struggle with sensory sensitivities with noise. That's when they'd be desperate to get into the office. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a flavour.
Yeah, I actually think, I mean, my sons are grown up, and I have never been so glad that they were out of education. When I look at how stressed the parents were trying to homeschool children, and even the ones that weren't working, and then the ones that were working, it was just a hideous situation to be in. Yeah. Totally hideous.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I think Brian's just put in a wee comment there saying it's an excellent presentation, which I heartily agree with.
Thank you.
Brings back memories of the 1990s, and this bit I don't know anything about. 1990s and policing struggling with medication for individuals with ADHD.
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you right now that there's a very high percentage of young offenders with ADHD and other neurodifferences. Professor Amanda Kirby, who is one of our kind of colleagues in this field, she's very highly regarded in neurodiversity. She's a GP, so she's a medic first and foremost, but she's dedicated her career to neurodiversity, and she does a lot of work in prisons and trying to kind of rehabilitate young offenders, because they have been excluded from school, excluded from social groups. and as a result have, you know, been sent down the wrong path, unfortunately. I mean, Richard Branson, who someone popped in the chat there, he said that it was a toss-up for him. He would either be a millionaire or he would be in jail. So yeah, there's lots that we need to start thinking about.
Lucky for him, he went the millionaire stroke billionaire route.
Oh yes. Yeah.
I mean, that really was a superb presentation, Vicki. Thank you so much. I'm sure, I mean, that, like I say, the dyslexia exercise will stay with me for a long time, and just raising our awareness, which was exactly what this is. I mean, I know that you had said that you would be happy to share your contact details if people want to get in touch. I can't remember, was it right at the start? Was it on your Lexic page at the start, your contact details?
I'll just pop it in the chat just now, but maybe when you do the follow-up, Judith, you could pop my details on there. I've got, I think it's my name's on the front slide, but not my email address. So I've just popped it in the chat there.
Brilliant.
But yeah, I'd be delighted to speak to any of you. I think you can probably tell I'm quite passionate about this area. So any excuse to have a blether.
but I also think, you know, just with the current shortages that we've got in recruitment, you know, we need as many people in the workforce as we possibly can have, and it sounds like we're missing a whole chunk of people who could be very productive, and you know, they're maybe missing out. Organizations are missing out on their skills and abilities. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure lots of people will be getting in touch with you, because I think it's an area that certainly people are more and more aware of now, which is and I think that's the first part of understanding something, is actually being aware of it, isn't it? And then doing more digging behind that to find out more about it. But I mean, thank you so much.
And it's about removing barriers, isn't it? You know, it's not about getting a label. you know, it's looking at what are the barriers, and how can we overcome them for individuals. So yeah, we're on a mission.
Excellent. Well, super. Thanks again, Vicki. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
Lovely to see you all. Oh, we've got someone from California.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
We work with some clients over there. Yeah, awesome.
That must be our furthest flung participant, I would guess.
I'm very jealous.
I know, me too. Yeah, Aberdeen or California. Take your pick. Listen, Vicki, lovely to have you on. Thank you so much for giving up your time. Lovely to see so many of you.
Thank you for the opportunity, Judith and Shona.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I'll be in touch. Cheers. Bye-bye now.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.